The glass of iced tea was sweating almost as much as I was. I set it down on the small wooden table beside the porch swing and watched the droplets roll down its sides, leaving wet rings on the weathered surface. Everything felt too quiet, too still. Even the birds seemed to be taking a break from their usual chatter, hiding somewhere in the thick branches of my sister Sarah's enormous oak tree. 6 months. That's how long it had been since I signed those final divorce papers. 6 months since I'd officially become Clara Mitchell again, dropping the Henderson I'd carried for 8 years like an old coat that no longer fit. 6 months of telling everyone I was doing great and loving my freedom while secretly feeling like I was floating in space without a tether. Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. The afternoon sun slanted through the leaves above me, creating a shifting pattern of light and shadow across the wooden porch boards. Visiting Sarah had always been good for my soul, but especially now. Her quiet suburban street, with its neat lawns and flower-lined walkways, felt like stepping into a different world. The scent of freshly cut grass drifted on the warm breeze, mixing with the sweet smell of honeysuckle growing wild along her fence. Everything here moved at a gentler pace. Sarah's neighbors still waved from their front yards. Children rode there, bikes in lazy circles on the sidewalk. People actually sat on their porches in the evenings, watching the world go by instead of staring at screens. It was so different from my cramped apartment in the city, where the only sounds were car horns and sirens, and I barely knew the names of the people living on either side of me. Sarah, bless her heart, had always known exactly when to fuss over me and when to just let me be. Today was definitely a let me be day, and I was grateful for it. She'd brought me the iced tea an hour ago, squeezed my shoulder gently, and disappeared back into her cool, dim kitchen without a word. Sometimes the best comfort comes from simply being allowed to exist without explanation or expectation. I shifted on the wicker cushions, trying to find a position that didn't make my sundress stick to my legs. The porch swing creaked softly with the movement, a sound I remembered from childhood visits. Sarah had lived in this house for 15 years now, and some things never changed. The swing still creaked on the same note. The oak tree still dropped its acorns on the roof each fall. The mailbox still leaned slightly to the left, despite her husband Tom's repeated attempts to straighten it. That's when I first noticed him. He appeared around the side of the tidy blue house next door, moving with the unhurried pace of someone who had nowhere urgent to be. He was whistling something low and melodic, a tune I couldn't quite place, but that sounded familiar somehow, like a half-remembered lullaby. In one hand, he carried a pair of work gloves so caked with dried dirt they looked more brown than their original color. In the other, he held a small garden trowel that caught the sunlight as he walked. I found myself studying him from my perch on the swing, partly out of curiosity and partly because there wasn't much else to look at on this sleepy afternoon. He wasn't what you'd call handsome in the way movie stars are, no sharp jawline or perfectly styled hair, but there was something appealing about him, something solid and dependable. His face was weathered in a way that spoke of time spent outdoors, with lines around his eyes that could have come from squinting in the sun or from years of easy laughter. Maybe both. His hair was more salt than pepper, slightly mussed, as if he'd been running his fingers through it while he worked. He wore a faded blue button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms tanned from outdoor work. His jeans were the kind that had earned their wear marks, honestly soft-looking and comfortable rather than store-bought distress. As he walked, he seemed completely absorbed in his own thoughts, his whistling drifting across the space between the houses. There was something peaceful about watching him, like observing a bird that didn't know it was being watched. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone comfortable in his own space, in his own skin. Then he looked up and saw me sitting there. His whistling stopped mid-note, and for a moment we just looked at each other across the expanse of green lawn. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, embarrassed to be caught staring. But instead of looking annoyed or uncomfortable, he simply smiled, a small, neighborly expression, and raised his free hand in a gentle wave. I waved back, feeling suddenly self-conscious about my wrinkled sundress and the way my hair was probably sticking to my forehead in the humidity. But his smile was genuine, reaching his eyes in a way that made the corners crinkle pleasantly. His eyes were an interesting color, hazel with flecks of green, like moss growing on a stone after rain. Sarah had mentioned her neighbor David several times during my visit. A widower, she'd said, lowering her voice in that way people do when discussing loss. Lost his wife a few years back to cancer. Such a tragedy, they were devoted to each other. He mostly keeps to himself now, but he's always been pleasant. Throws himself into that garden of his. You should see his roses, they're absolutely stunning. David hesitated for a moment at the edge of his lawn, gloves and trowel still in his hands. I could see him considering something, maybe debating whether to simply wave and continue on his way or to be more sociable. The afternoon hung between us, full of possibility and the lazy drone of insects in the flower beds. Then he seemed to make a decision. He walked purposefully across the strip of grass that separated the two properties, his steps sure and unhurried. He stopped at the foot of Sarah's porch steps, looking up at me with those moss-green eyes. "Afternoon," he said, and I was surprised by his voice. It was deeper than I'd expected, warm and pleasant with a slight roughness around the edges, like aged whiskey or worn leather. There was something comforting about it, something that made you want to lean in and listen more closely. "You must be Sarah's sister, Clara, right?" I nodded, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear that had escaped from my ponytail. "That's me. And you're David." His smile widened, becoming more genuine and less polite. "Guilty as charged. Sarah talks about you quite a bit, said you were visiting for a while, getting away from the city." I was touched that Sarah had spoken of me to her neighbors, though not entirely surprised. My sister had always been the type to form real connections with the people around her, to know their stories and share her own. It was one of the things I'd always admired about her, and if I was being honest, sometimes envied. "Just for the week," I replied, trying to sound casual despite the flutter of nerves in my stomach. "Trying to recharge the batteries, you know? Sometimes you need to step away from everything for a while." David nodded slowly, understanding flickering in his expression. "This is a good place for it," he agreed, glancing around Sarah's peaceful yard with its carefully tended flower beds, and the old oak tree that dominated the space. "Quiet, good neighbors." There was a slight emphasis on those last words, and I found myself wondering if he was referring to himself or just the neighborhood in general. We fell into a comfortable silence for a moment, not the awkward kind that makes you scramble for something to say, but the restful kind that feels natural. The air around us hummed with the sounds of a summer afternoon, the distant drone of lawnmowers, the buzz of bees working their way through Sarah's overflowing flower beds, the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. David leaned against the porch railing, crossing his arms in a gesture that was relaxed rather than defensive. He wasn't imposing or taking up too much space, just present, solid, real. There was something reassuring about his presence that I couldn't quite put my finger on. "Anything particularly interesting blooming over there?" he asked, nodding toward a vibrant patch of peonies that were putting on quite a show along Sarah's front walk. Their full, ruffled heads were a riot of pink and white, almost too perfect to be real. "Sarah's got the magic touch," I said, following his gaze to the impressive display. "Mine always seem to sulk no matter what I do. I can keep houseplants alive, but put me in front of an actual garden and everything just gives up." David chuckled, a low, pleasant sound that seemed to come easily to him. "They can be temperamental, like people sometimes. Some need more attention, some prefer to be left alone. It's all about figuring out what each one needs and being patient enough to give it time." He looked directly at me then, and there was something in his gaze that felt unexpectedly intimate. It wasn't flirtatious, not exactly, but it was seeing. Like he wasn't just looking at Sarah's sister sitting on the porch swing, but actually seeing me, Clara, with all my uncertainties and recent changes. It was both flattering and unsettling, and I found myself looking down at my iced tea, watching the ice cubes shift and clink against the glass. "So," I said, searching for something neutral to keep the conversation going without getting too deep too quickly, "gardening keeps you pretty busy, I imagine?" David nodded, his gaze drifting toward his own property, where I could see neat rows of flower beds bordering the fence between the yards. Even from this distance, it was clear that his garden was meticulously maintained, not in an obsessive way, but with the kind of care that comes from genuine love of the work. "It does," he said thoughtfully. "Gets me out of my head, you know? There's something about digging in the dirt, watching things grow from nothing. It grounds you, reminds you that some things take time, but they're worth waiting for." I understood that feeling completely. My own small apartment balcony garden, 3 pots of herbs and a struggling tomato plant was my sanctuary, my escape from the noise and stress of daily life. It was nowhere near as impressive as his or Sarah's, elaborate displays, but it served the same purpose, a place to breathe, to think, to remember that growth was possible even in small spaces. I get that, I murmured, surprised by how much I wanted to share this understanding with him. There's something satisfying about nurturing something, watching it respond to your care, even when it doesn't always work out the way you planned. David looked back at me, that thoughtful expression returning to his face. Exactly. You put something in the ground, you care for it, you hope for the best. Most times, if you're patient and pay attention, you get something beautiful back. Not always, sometimes things don't work out despite your best efforts, but often enough to make it worth trying. Was he just talking about flowers? It felt like more than that, like he was sharing a piece of his philosophy, his way of understanding life and loss and the possibility of new growth. There was a depth to his words that suggested experience with disappointment as well as success, with endings as well as beginnings. Just then, Sarah's screen door creaked open with its familiar protest, and she bustled out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her favorite apron, the one covered in sunflowers that she'd had for at least 10 years. "David," she said, her face lighting up with genuine pleasure. "I thought I heard voices out here. Don't tell me you're already stealing my sister away from me." She was teasing, but there was real warmth in her voice, the kind that spoke of years of neighborly friendship and mutual respect. "Just saying hello," David replied easily, straightening up from his casual position against the railing. "And admiring your peonies. They're really putting on a show this year." Sarah beamed with pride, glancing over at her prized flower display. "Oh, aren't they gorgeous? I was just telling Clara yesterday that this is the best they've ever looked. But you should see David's roses. Clara, they're absolutely prize-winning. Truly spectacular." David waved a dismissive hand, and I caught a faint blush creeping up his neck. "Sarah exaggerates." "I do not," Sarah insisted, her voice taking on the tone of someone who'd had this argument before. "Mrs. Patterson from 3 houses down stops by just to look at them. And the Johnsons asked if you'd help them with their rose bed next spring." "Listen," Sarah continued, clearly enjoying herself, "I was just about to put the kettle on for a proper cup of tea. David, would you like to join us? None of this ice stuff that Claire's been nursing all afternoon, a real cup of tea." David glanced at me, and I caught something questioning in his expression, as if he was checking to make sure his presence would be welcome. "Well, I wouldn't want to intrude." "Nonsense," Sarah declared, already holding the screen door open wider. "Clara needs the company, even if she won't admit it. Besides, it's too hot to be standing around out here." I shot Sarah a look that was half annoyed, half amused. She'd always been a bit of a matchmaker, though usually more subtle about it, but David just chuckled again, that easy sound that was becoming familiar. "All right then," he said, carefully wiping his boots on the mat before stepping inside. "Lead the way." As I followed them into the cool dimness of Sarah's kitchen, I felt a strange little flutter in my chest. It wasn't just the neighbors stopping by for tea, it felt like something more. A subtle shift in the quiet afternoon air, like the moment before a summer storm when you can feel the change coming but can't quite name what it will bring. The kitchen was cozy and welcoming, filled with the lingering scent of cinnamon from whatever Sarah had been baking earlier. Probably her famous snickerdoodles. She always made them when she was expecting company, even unexpected company. The late afternoon light streamed through the gingham curtains, casting everything in a warm golden glow. David settled into one of the wooden chairs at Sarah's small kitchen table, looking perfectly at home despite being a guest. He had the kind of presence that seemed to fit easily into any space, not commanding attention, but not fading into the background either. Just comfortable, solid, real. I took the seat across from him, suddenly feeling strangely shy, like a teenager again. When was the last time I'd felt this kind of nervous energy around someone new? It had been years, maybe not since before my marriage, when meeting someone still felt full of possibility instead of complication. David didn't seem to notice my sudden attack of self-consciousness, or if he did, he was kind enough not to let on. Instead, he was asking Sarah about her famous zucchini plants, the ones that had won second place at the county fair last summer. "Oh, those zucchini." Sarah launched into the story with enthusiasm, her hands moving expressively as she filled the kettle and set it on the stove. "You should have seen the size of them, Clara. Practically the size of baseball bats. I was giving them away to anyone who would take them by the end of the season." I listened, watching David as Sarah talked. He was a good listener, the kind who actually pays attention instead of just waiting for his turn to speak. His gaze never left Sarah's face as she gestured animatedly, and he asked questions at all the right moments, showing genuine interest in her gardening adventures. It was nice to see. So many people these days seem to have forgotten how to really listen, how to be present in a conversation instead of thinking about what they wanted to say next or checking their phones every few minutes. When Sarah paused to pour the boiling water over the tea bags in her favorite ceramic teapot, the one with the faded roses that had been her mother's, David turned his attention back to me. "So Clara," he began, his tone casual but interested, "Sarah mentioned that you work with old documents? Something about preserving local history?" I was surprised again by how much Sarah had apparently shared about my life, though I shouldn't have been. She'd always been proud of my work, even when I felt like it was too quiet and unglamorous to be worth mentioning. "That's right," I confirmed, feeling more confident, talking about something I knew well. "I work for the city archives, preserving old documents, photographs, letters, anything that helps tell the story of how the community developed over time. It's quiet work, but I find it fascinating." "I can imagine," David said, leaning forward slightly, his interest clearly genuine. "There must be something powerful about holding a piece of the past in your hands, knowing that you're helping to keep someone's story alive." His understanding surprised me. Most people, when they learned what I did for a living, either looked confused or made polite but disinterested comments before changing the subject. But David seemed to grasp immediately why the work mattered. "It really is," I said, warming to the topic. "Sometimes you find these incredible little forgotten stories tucked away in personal letters or old diaries. Ordinary people living what turn out to be extraordinary lives, or just capturing moments that seem small, but tell you so much about what life was like back then." "I think I know what you mean," David said, his voice growing softer, more thoughtful. "My wife Mary, she used to keep diaries, pages and pages, every day for years. After she passed, I found them in her bedside table drawer." He paused, looking down at his hands where they rested on the table. They were strong hands, capable looking, with soil still visible around the nails, despite his earlier attempts to clean them. There was something honest about those hands, something that spoke of real work and genuine care. "It took me almost a year before I could bring myself to read them," he continued, "but when I finally did, it was like getting to know her all over again. Little things she'd noticed, worries she'd never shared with me, moments of joy I'd forgotten or hadn't even realized she'd experienced. It was hard, but it was also a gift." The vulnerability in his voice touched something deep inside me. Sharing something so personal with someone he'd just met wasn't typical, but it didn't feel forced or uncomfortable. It felt honest, real. Like he understood that some stories needed to be told, that some connections were worth the risk of opening up. Sarah placed steaming mugs in front of us, her movements quiet and careful. She'd always been good at reading a room, at knowing when to step back and let a moment unfold naturally. "That sounds incredibly meaningful, David," she said gently, settling into the third chair with her own mug. David looked up, offering a small but genuine smile. "It was hard, but meaningful. It taught me a lot about paying attention to the small moments, about the importance of really seeing the people we love." He turned back to me, and I felt the full weight of his attention. "So I understand the fascination with old stories, with preserving those pieces of the past. They're important. They remind us who we are, where we came from, what matters." We talked then, easily and comfortably, about books we'd read and places we'd traveled or dreamed of visiting. David had spent time in the Navy when he was younger, had seen parts of the world I'd only read about in books or seen in documentaries. He spoke about the Mediterranean, about small Italian coastal towns where time seemed to move differently, about the way the light fell on ancient buildings at sunset. I told him about my work, about the peculiar satisfaction of carefully piecing together a fragmented letter or identifying faces in a century-old photograph, about the detective work involved in tracing the history of a building or understanding the social dynamics of a long-vanished community. Sarah mostly listened, sipping her tea and occasionally adding a comment or memory, but largely letting the conversation flow between David and me. I could see her watching us with that knowing look she got when she was pleased about something, but she was subtle about it, letting us discover our own rhythm. It struck me how different this felt from most of the conversations I'd had in recent months. There were no pretenses here, no attempts to impress or perform. It was just connection. The simple pleasure of discovering shared interests, of understanding different perspectives, of finding common ground with someone new. David had a dry sense of humor that surfaced unexpectedly, catching me off guard and making me laugh out loud. More than once, he asked about my life, not invasively, but with genuine curiosity about what made me tick, what I cared about, what I hoped for. I found myself telling him things I hadn't even fully articulated to Sarah. About feeling disconnected in the city sometimes, about the strange sense of being untethered since my divorce, about not knowing quite what came next in my life. He listened patiently, his hazel eyes thoughtful and kind. "Change is hard," he said quietly, after I trailed off, unsure why I'd shared so much with this man I'd just met. "It feels like the ground shifting under your feet, like you can't quite find your balance. But sometimes, and I know this might be hard to believe right now, sometimes it shifts you onto more solid ground. You just can't see it yet. Takes time to realize where you've landed." His words, simple as they were, landed in my chest like anchors. He wasn't offering platitudes or easy answers, wasn't trying to fix anything or minimize what I was feeling. He was just acknowledging the truth of it, sharing a perspective that had clearly been forged from his own experience with loss and change. Outside, the shadows were beginning to lengthen as the afternoon moved toward evening. The golden light was getting richer, warmer, painting everything with that magical quality that summer afternoons sometimes have just before they slip into dusk. Sarah got up to clear the mugs, and David pushed his chair back slightly. "Well," he said, "I should probably let you ladies get on with your evening. Thank you for the tea, Sarah. And Clara." He looked directly at me. "It was really nice talking with you." "You too, David," I said, and I meant it completely. There had been a sincerity in our conversation that felt rare, valuable, like finding something unexpected and precious. As Sarah walked him to the door, I stayed at the kitchen table, tracing the rim of my empty mug with one finger. I felt lighter somehow, though the conversation hadn't solved anything or magically erased the uncertainties in my life. But it had opened a window, let in some fresh air. It had reminded me that connection could happen unexpectedly, quietly, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. When Sarah came back, she had a knowing little smile playing around the corners of her mouth. "He's nice, isn't he?" she asked, stacking the mugs in the sink with careful precision. "Yes," I agreed, meeting her gaze in the reflection of the kitchen window. "He really is." Nothing more needed to be said. The quiet understanding hung in the air between us, comfortable and warm, like the lingering scent of tea and the golden light of late afternoon. Scent of cinnamon. The next few days fell into a pleasant rhythm. I helped Sarah in her garden. We visited local antique shops, and I spent quiet hours reading on the porch. David was a regular presence next door, often puttering in his yard-weight exchange. Waves sometimes chat briefly over the fence about the weather or the progress of his roses, which were indeed spectacular. Each brief interaction felt easy, natural. There was no awkwardness, just a growing sense of familiarity. One evening Sarah had a meeting for her book club, leaving me on my own. I made a simple salad for dinner and settled back onto the porch swing, as twilight painted the sky in shades of lavender and rose. The air was cooler, no carrying the scent of night-blooming jasmine. From somewhere down the street, I saw David come out onto his own porch, holding a glass of what looked like whiskey. He saw me, hesitated only a second, then ambled over, much like he had the first day. "Evening, Clara," he said, stopping at the steps again. "Mind if I join you for a bit? Quiet night over here?" "Not at all," I smiled, gesturing to the wicker armchair opposite the swing. "Please." He sat down, stretching his legs out. We sat in silence for a while, watching the first stars prick the darkening sky. It was peaceful, not the tense silence of strangers, but the companionable quiet of people comfortable in each other's presence. "Sarah off solving the world's problems with her book club?" he asked, eventually, asmal in his voice. I chuckled. "Something like that tonight. It's a historical novel, so maybe just solving the past's problems." The past," he mused, swirling Thember liquid in his glass. "Easier to solve than the present usually." "Isn't that the truth?" I agreed softly. He took a slow sip of his drink. "You know, Clara," he said, his voice thoughtful, "what you were saying the other day about feeling untethered. I felt that way for a long time after Mary died, like I was just drifting, work, home, sleep, repeat. Garden helped, like I said, gave me a focus." He paused, looking out towards the street lights flickering on, "but connection That's different, takes more than just routine. I nodded, understanding implicitly. Routine could keep you busy, keep you functioning, but it couldn't fill the hollow spaces. It's hard to find sometimes, I admitted, or maybe hard to let yourself find. He turned his gaze towards me, his expression serious but kind. Maybe it finds you when you least expect it, or when you finally stop bracing yourself against it. His words hung in the air. It felt like we were talking about more than just general connection. It felt personal. My heart gave a little thump against my ribs. Wash, no, I told myself, he's just being kind, philosophical, a widower hour sharing his thoughts with his sister's divorced neighbor. Don't read too much into it, but still, there was an intensity in the quiet moment, shared understanding that transcended polite conversation. He must have sensed my slight discomfort because he shifted slightly, his tone becoming lighter. Speaking of finding things, he said, I was clearing out a corner of my garage today, found an old box of Mary's full of sheet music. She played the piano beautifully. Oh wow. I said, does the piano still? Oh yeah. He nodded, it's in the living room, big old upright, haven't touched it much since, well, but looking at that music today. He trailed off. Did you ever play? I asked. He shook his head. Not tiner me, but I loved listening to her. He looked at me again. Do you play, Clara? A warmth spread through me. I used to, I admitted, a long time ago. My grandmother taught me. Nothing fancy, just simple tunes. An idea sparked in his eyes. Listen, this might be forward, but would you want to see at the music, maybe even play something the piano could probably use? Waking up, my breath caught. Go into his house alone. It felt significant, but his invitation was so genuine, so devoid of any pressure, just a simple, almost sheer quest, and the thought of touching piano keys again after so long, it was strangely appealing. I'm probably terribly rusty, I stammered, feeling the teenage shyness again. Doesn't matter, he said gently. Tinier, remember? Besides, he gave a small smile. It's just an old piano. Sitting in the dark might like the company. I looked at his earnest face, the kindness in his eyes. What harm could there be? It wasn't a proposition. It felt like an offering, a sharing of something precious. Okay, David, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I'd like that. He stood up, offering me his hand to help me off the low swing. His hand was warm, strong, callous from gardening. The simple contact sent a surprising jolt through me, warmth that had nothing to do with the fading summer evening. We walked across the lawn, the grass cool and damp beneath my sandals, towards the soft light spilling from his living room window. His house felt like him, solid, comfortable, unpretentious. Books lined shelves, photos sat on the mantelpiece, a smiling woman with kind eyes, presumably Mary, alongside pictures of what looked like children and grandchildren. It felt like a home filled with memories lived in and loved. The piano, a dark wood upright, dominated one wall of the living room. It looked well cared for, polished but silent. David led me over to it, opening a worn cardboard box resting on a nearby chair. Here it is, he said softly. The box was filled with sheet music, yellowed with age, classical pieces, old standards, handwritten scores. It was a tangible piece of his wife's life, her passion. I reached and almost reverently lifting out a brittle piece of music, Chopin. Something I hadn't attempted since I was a girl. She loved Chopin, David murmured, watching me. Said his music held all the emotions you couldn't put into words. I carefully opened the lid covering the piano keys. They were ivory, smooth and cool beneath my hesitant fingers. It had been years, more than I cared to count. Sitting down on the worn bench felt both strange and incredibly familiar. David stood nearby, it crowding me, just present. No pressure, he said quietly. Just if you feel like I took a deep breath. My fingers hovered over the keys. What if I could tremor anything? What if I just made horrible, clunky noises? Then I thought of what David had said about the piano liking the company. I thought about Mary pouring her emotions into this instrument. I thought about the unexpected connection I felt sitting here in this quiet house with this kind man. My fingers found a simple chord, thin another, tentative at first, like finding my footing on uneven ground. I started with something easy, a lullaby my grandmother had taught me. The notes filled the quiet room, a little hesitant, a little uneven but clear. The piano had a beautiful tone, rich and mellow. As I played, the initial stiffness in my fingers began to ease. The melody flowed more smoothly. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it felt good, like stretching a muscle I hadn't used in far too long. I glanced up at David. He was leaning against the door frame, his eyes closed, a soft, almost wistful expression on his face. He wasn't Judging my rusty playing, he was just listening, remembering. Emboldened, I tried something else, a simple piece I recalled from years ago. The music seemed to fill the space between us, weaving a thread of shared experience. It wasn't about performance. It was about the act itself, the shared vulnerability, the resurrection of something beautiful from silence. When the last note faded, the silence that followed felt different, charged, somehow full. David opened his eyes. They looked darker in the lamplight. Deeper thank you, Clara, he said, his voice thick with emotion that was Mary would have loved that. Hearing her name spoken with such tenderness didn't feel intrusive. It felt like I'd been allowed into a sacred space, offered a glimpse into the love he still carried. I felt tears prickle behind my own eyes for his loss, for the beauty of the music, for the unexpected intimacy of the moment. She must have been wonderful, I whispered. He nodded, swallowing. She was. He walked slowly over to the piano bench, and after a moment's hesitation, sat down beside me, not too close, maintaining a respectful distance, but near enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him. We didn't speak for a long moment. We just sat there side by side, looking at the silent keys, surrounded by the lingering aggressiveness of the music and the weight of unspoken emotions. Then he slowly reached